In 2004, an unidentified middle-aged man was found next to a Burger King dumpster in Richmond Hill, Georgia. This man was naked, sunburned, and unconscious. But more mysteriously, he had no name, no past, no memory, and no record that he even ever existed. What you're about to hear might sound like the plot of a Christopher Nolan movie, but it is the stranger-than-fiction, true-life story of America's first living nobody, Benjaman Kyle. August 31st, 2004. It was an early morning on a warm summer day in Richmond Hill, Georgia. Sanyo Auer, a Burger King employee, makes her way to the dumpster to throw out the trash when she comes across a naked man lying on the ground unconscious. Even though the day hasn't dawned, this man is sweating and even looks sunburned. All over his body, fire ants are crawling, leaving angry red bite marks, even as a hot red rash flecks across his skin. Auer definitely doesn't get paid enough for this, so she screams and runs inside the restaurant, where she calls the police.
I don't know, I think he's passed out, but he could be dead. I really don't know. Hey ma'am, where are you? Covered in blood, he's naked. It looks like somebody tried to kill him. I don't know. Calm down, ma'am. We'll send an ambulance. Oh my God, oh my God.
When the police arrive, they meet the man awake, although he seems very confused. Seeing as it was nothing serious, one of the officers in his report summarizes the case as a vagrant who had been found sleeping. Soon after, an ambulance arrives which takes the unidentified man to St. Joseph's Hospital, Savannah. Since he has no name, and the hospital already has a John Doe, they christen their newest patient Burger King Doe. Now at the hospital, the doctors proceed to conduct a physical examination on Burger King Doe, and from the look of things, BK Doe is quite healthy except for the red rash and the cataracts that have nearly blinded him. Even his vitals are excellent. His blood is clean, and his lab results, according to the doctor, are surprisingly within normal limits. Externally though, BK Doe looks quite rough. He's got a long and dirty beard, and his fingernails are also caked with dirt. On the back of his skull are 3 small depressions, and he's also got some scars on his neck and on his left arm. But these physical signs appear to have come from previous traumas, which means that BK Doe was not assaulted recently. It also makes his story kinda bizarre. As the doctors continue to interact with BK Doe, they start to realize that there's something really wrong with him psychologically speaking. For instance, Doe won't eat or speak or open his eyes. And if someone tries to touch his chest, he jerks his hands and legs around violently. In fact, it takes several days in the hospital before BK Doe finally agrees to eat some ice chips and say a few words. When he does, he tells the nurses that people call him BK and that he lived in the woods for 17 years. A few days later, Doe has a psychotic episode, and so he's moved to Memorial Health, a public hospital just across town. While there, he is admitted into the psych ward, where the doctors try once again to find out more about him. But BK Doe doesn't seem to remember much about who he is. He doesn't remember his name, he doesn't remember where he's from, he doesn't remember how he arrived in Georgia, he doesn't remember his family. He does have some suspicions about where he's from, but he's really just speculating. He doesn't know for sure. He says he's probably from Indianapolis, and probably has 3 brothers, although he has no idea what their names are, or even what they look like. Speaking of, BK Doe does not seem able to remember many images either, and the few he does remember are quite dim. He does recall an old movie theater, a long road that passed through a cornfield, and some streets in a place he believes to be Denver, but other than these few hazy images, BK Doe can't recall anything else. There's one thing BK Doe knows for sure though. He was born exactly 10 years before the greatest pop star of all time, Michael Jackson. This puts Doe's birthday on August 29th, 1948. As time goes by, BK Doe seems to be getting better psychologically. He starts talking a bit more, and even though his memories don't exactly come back, he's obviously doing well. So he's moved out of the psych ward and into the J.C. Lewis Primary Health Care Center, which caters to the homeless. It's here that BK Doe remembers his real name for the first time, or at least what he believes to be his real name, Benjaman, with 2 A's. Benjaman can't remember his last name though, so in the meantime, he chooses the name Kyle, Benjaman Kyle. Even though Kyle is essentially homeless, his new life at the shelter turns out to be not so bad. He's super helpful with chores, so he quickly becomes everyone's favorite. He also proves to be a voracious reader, tearing through the shelter's tiny library at remarkable speed. Anyway, fast forward to 2 years later, and Kyle makes a new friend. And although he doesn't know it yet, this friend will play a very crucial role on his journey to rediscovering his lost identity. Kyle's new friend is a middle-aged, grandmotherly nurse named Catherine Slater. When Slater first meets Kyle, she's drawn to him. Then she hears his story, and she's completely moved by it, so she makes a decision right there and then to help Kyle figure out who he is and reunite with his family, whatever it would take. Looking back, Slater would say that she had set out trying to uncover Kyle's true identity, believing it would take 6 months tops. In reality, however, Slater, along with a whole community of police detectives, FBI agents, investigative journalists, genealogists, and amateur detectives, would end up spending nearly a decade trying to crack this case. What makes Kyle's case particularly mysterious is the fact he was repeatedly paraded on the internet and on television. He was seen by millions and talked about by all of America, and yet not even one person came forward to say that they knew him. And you've got to recognize how bizarre all of this is because ours is an age of highly sophisticated documentation and surveillance. We've got scores of ways we keep tabs on others, and for others to keep tabs on us. Social security, social media, big data, criminal records, credit scores, drones, wiretapping, camera phones. Humans essentially created a society where people like Benjaman Kyle should never exist. And yet, here he was, a real-life nobody, with no legal name and no record that he ever existed. How exactly did this happen? When Catherine Slater begins her search for Benjaman Kyle's identity, she assumes that someone is out there looking for him too. So, she sleuths around missing person forums on the internet and posts photos of Kyle on message boards. But nothing comes out of this. No one recognizes Kyle. With that door closed, Slater reaches out to the police. Considering the condition in which Kyle was discovered, Slater had assumed that Benjaman had probably been assaulted by someone who also stole his clothes. But when she talks to the police in Richmond Hills, she's informed that Kyle wasn't assaulted, and so a criminal case was never opened. Left with no other choice, Slater takes the case to the FBI. Unfortunately, the FBI doesn't seem very willing to take up the case. Not knowing who you are may be tragic, but it's definitely not a crime, and so they say they can't investigate. They do, however, try to run Kyle's fingerprints across the FBI National Database. You probably might not know this, but the FBI fingerprint database is the largest in the world. It contains over 100 million sets of prints. But when Kyle's fingerprints are run through, there are no matches. The FBI also puts up Kyle's pictures on its missing persons page, effectively making Kyle the first ever American to be classified as missing, even though his whereabouts were known. But this also fails to produce any new leads. Expanding the search radius, the FBI sends out copies of Kyle's prints to law enforcement in Canada and to Interpol. Nothing. The FBI even checks with the US Marshals Service to see if perhaps Kyle was in WITSEC, but once again nothing turns up. At least now we know Kyle wasn't a criminal. Or was he just too clever to be caught? Anyway, at one point investigators start to think, what if Kyle is actually on the FBI database but under a different name? So they decide to check out all missing persons with physical characteristics matching Kyle's, dating as far back as the 70s. 350 cases later, and Kyle's identity still remains unmatched. By 2007, Slater is truly frustrated. Every single new lead she's pursued has somehow managed to lead to a dead end, so she decides it's time to contact the media. Maybe if more people saw Kyle's photos, someone would finally identify him. As you'd expect, once mainstream media got wind of Kyle's incredible story, it was all over the place.
Benjaman Kyle.
Good morning, Benjaman. Normally we say, how are you? But in your case, we'll say, who are you?
is no closer to death.
All of a sudden, Kyle starts getting multiple calls for interviews as outlet after outlet reels out stories of the real-life nobody, the nowhere man, the living John Doe. The wide media coverage triggers the influx of tips from all over the country, making it seem like Slater's plan was working. Unfortunately, as she worked these tips, one after the other, they all led to a dead end. Then one day, Dr. Phil calls. He wants to have Kyle and Slater on his show. This is obviously going to be a pivotal moment in the search for Kyle's true identity, because Dr. Phil has a staggering audience. So without hesitation, Slater and Kyle get on a plane and fly to Los Angeles for a taping of the show. When the episode finally airs on October 16, 2008, it is watched by over 4 million people, and almost the same number of people catch the reruns. Dr. Phil also sets up a hotline for people to call in if they recognized Kyle. But once again, all the tips that came in are either vague or downright useless.
Earlier, and I explained to Ben at that point that there's no surprises today. We're not gonna, jump up and parade out your wife and 5 kids or anything of the sort, because I don't think that would be a right thing to do with you at all. What we want to do is learn as much about you as we can.
Slowly, Kyle's dream of discovering his true identity seems to be devolving into something of a nightmare. I mean, it's one thing to be missing, but it's another thing entirely to realize that no one is missing you.
When the media heard the story, they became determined to solve the mystery.
By the name Benjaman Kyle.
Good morning, Benjamin. Normally we say, how are you? But in your case, we'll say, who are you?
Is no closer today to
And
know
then
who he is.
the doctor stepped in.
This is an age-regressed photo of Benjamin as he might have looked at various ages.
And finally, the FBI was on the case.
Since then, they have taken my fingerprints both electronically and the old ink method several times, and they cannot find my fingerprints anywhere in any database.
But to date, we've simply just not been able to identify him.
For all practical intents and purposes, I don't exist.
Benjamin became the first U.S. citizen to be listed as missing, despite his whereabouts being known. And the FBI left it at that.
Everyone we talked to out there swore up and down that they were going to solve the case. They didn't.
With no happy ending, the media gave up.
All the national media, they want the big story when they introduce me to my relatives and everything, but they don't. Until that happens, they're not interested in doing an article about the search. It's when you think about it, it's pretty pathetic if no one's actually looking for someone that disappeared. I mean, isn't there anyone important enough in your past life that they'd want to look for you?
Anyway, a few months after the Dr. Phil episode, in February of 2009, Catherine Slater gets a call from a woman called Colleen Fitzpatrick. Fitzpatrick introduces herself as a genealogical detective, explaining that she could use DNA databases and public records to help you explore your family history. Now, I know genealogical detective might sound just a teeny bit out there, but it turns out Fitzpatrick is actually terrific at her job. Under her belt is the successful identification of the remains of a child who drowned on the Titanic, as well as the successful identification of someone whose arm was preserved in the Alaskan snow after they perished in a 1948 plane crash. So, Fitzpatrick really knows her stuff, and maybe she could help Kyle before his situation worsens. He's already in a bad enough place as is. Even though he moved in with Slater after leaving the shelter, Kyle doesn't have a social security number, and because he likely already had one in the past, the Social Security Administration says they can't issue him a new one. This means that Kyle can't get a job or even access to food stamps or any other government benefits. The only way he can make money to survive now is to mow lawns for Slater's neighbors for a meager sum of about $100 a month. It's interesting, though, that as Kyle's situation worsens, he seems to be recovering a few more memories, just little islands of them. For instance, he remembers attending the Indiana State Fair as a child and buying cheese sandwiches for $0.25. He also remembers that he came to Boulder, Colorado just before the Big Thompson flood, and that he loved to eat Mexican food at a certain Mama Elena's in Denver. although he hated the service at a restaurant called Azar's. Additionally, Kyle remembered that he used to read a magazine called Restaurants and Institutions at the library at the University of Colorado, and that he watched the movie Car Wash at a theater in Denver. Now, considering that Car Wash was released in 1976 and the Big Thompson Flood also happened in 1976, that would place Kyle in Colorado from the mid-1970s probably into the mid-80s. Unfortunately, that was all the additional memories that Kyle was able to recollect. His memory after that was completely clean. Meanwhile, Fitzpatrick flies into Georgia from California to speak with Kyle, finding him friendly and articulate. After talking with him, our genealogist detective begins her search by publishing articles about Kyle in local newspapers in Indianapolis, Denver, and Boulder. She also reaches out to DMVs in Georgia, Colorado, and Indiana to see if they could match Kyle's photo with any driver's license. Since Kyle is adamant that he was born on August 29, 1948, Fitzpatrick checks out data from that time period as well. Birth announcements, birth certificates, church records, even military draft records. She then sends out flyers to restaurants and homeless shelters in Indiana. But as you can probably predict at this point, none of these efforts leads anywhere. Even Kyle's session with a hypnotist, which has been used to retrieve memories from alien abductees like the children in Africa who saw aliens. But with Kyle, it didn't help much. So Fitzpatrick decides to check out Kyle's body to see if there was anything they had missed earlier that could lead them closer to a solve. Kyle didn't have on a wedding ring, and it didn't look like he ever did. He also didn't have any piercings, tattoos, or birthmarks. He did have quite a number of scars though. One on his collarbone that looked like it might have come from a surgery, and 2 arc-shaped scars on his left elbow that Kyle suspects he got in his 20s after falling off a loading dock in Indiana. Whether Kyle is remembering correctly or not, the trauma did leave his bone broken such that it had to be secured with 2 screws. This could have been very helpful for Fitzpatrick's investigation, but the screw is super common and therefore impossible to trace. Discovering nothing helpful on Kyle's body, Fitzpatrick begins to dig deeper into Kyle's DNA. The FBI's attempt to find a DNA match might have been unsuccessful, but the genealogist isn't looking for DNA matches. She's looking for Kyle's relatives. Thanks to ancestry services like 23andMe, all Fitzpatrick has to do is submit Kyle's DNA sample, and when the results are returned, she can build out Kyle's family tree, beginning with more distant relatives and then narrowing down until she gets to Kyle's parents, which would crack this case once and for all. This time, Fitzpatrick's effort proved successful. The test shows that Kyle could have some familial connection with a family called the Powells. Great, that means Kyle's last name is actually Powell, right? Well, not so fast. All we know at this point is that Kyle and the Powell family share a common ancestor from the 20th century. Still, it's a pretty good lead, and things go very smoothly from here. Not only does Fitzpatrick find Kyle's distant ancestor, she also finds that he seems to have a significant number of close genetic matches in Transylvania and Pickens in Western Carolina. So she puts out ads in a Transylvanian paper while she tries to reach out to other known Powells to get their DNA samples. Hundreds of hours later, Fitzpatrick is on the verge of a huge break in the case. But then, out of nowhere, Kyle completely cuts her off with no explanation whatsoever. Shortly after Kyle brings Fitzpatrick's work on his case to an abrupt end, he meets another genealogist, C.C. Moore. Just like Fitzpatrick, Moore knew about Y testing, but she also had expertise in autosomal DNA analysis, which yields much more detailed results. Because the Y chromosome is passed down through the males of a family, it can really only reveal one side of the outermost branches of a family tree. Autosomal DNA, on the other hand, comes from both father and mother, so you get to see branches from everywhere on the family tree, which means you just need to get enough branches and then you can reverse engineer a family tree. Now, even though autosomal DNA analysis is more detailed than Y testing, and Moore is extremely good at her job, Kyle's case still proves to be exceptionally difficult for the genealogist. She does make progress, but it takes way more time than Moore could have imagined when she first took the case. Anyway, The DNA matches Moore finds suggest that most of Kyle's ancestors were Northern Europeans, and that his paternal grandparents and great-grandparents likely came from Southern America. Kyle's closest relative for now, though, seems to be a certain Abraham Lovely Powell, who lived in the 19th century. Moore continues to work on Kyle's case, turning every stone possible to get closer to his true identity. But then years pass and the world moves on from Kyle. The media is no longer carrying his story. The calls for interviews fizzle, and now all chances of Kyle ever being identified seem to be evaporating into thin air. And then, one day, out of nowhere, Kyle gets a call. It's Moore, and she has some good news. For years, Moore had been trying to piece Kyle's genetic information together, but then one day, a genealogist from South Carolina reached out to her. The lady had heard about Moore's work on Facebook, but even more interestingly, she was a Powell, and she was on her way to a family reunion. The coincidence couldn't have been more serendipitous. At Moore's request, the Powell lady takes DNA samples from her cousins at the reunion party, and these samples help Moore fill out Kyle's family tree. Dozens of hours later, Moore traces Kyle's parentage to one of the great-grandsons of the Powell family, who had died in Indiana. Soon after, she stumbles on a 1967 high school yearbook from Jefferson High School, Lafayette. When she spots a teenager with huge glasses, a crinkle-eyed smile, and a lantern jaw, she knows immediately that it's Kyle. Or should I say, William Burgess Powell. As it turns out, Kyle had been right about almost everything he recalled from his past. William Burgess Powell was born to Furman and Marjorie Powell on August 29, 1948, exactly 10 years before Michael Jackson was born. Kyle's father, Furman, died in 1969 during a boating accident, while his mother died after a battle with cancer in 1996. Just as he suspected, Kyle did have 3 brothers, Furman Jr., Thomas, and Robert. Thomas died as a child, but Furman Jr. and Robert were still living. Furman Jr. in the family house at Lafayette, and Robert in Florida. Uncovering Kyle's identity was a huge victory for him, for his family, and for everyone who worked on his case. However, it still didn't resolve all the mysteries around Benjaman Kyle, like how he lost his memory in the first place, and where he was for the 2 decades that he was missing. The last known record for William Burgess Powell dates back to 1983. After that, there's no record of any income, no address, no phone number, no mortgage, no marriage certificate, nothing at all. There has to be something in these missing 2 decades that would lead us to the story of Kyle's peculiar amnesia. Except, of course, if he was making the whole thing up. After all, he wouldn't be the first person to do it. Alright, so it's December 2007. A middle-aged man, John Ronald Darwin, walks into a police station in West End, London, saying, "I think I may be a missing person." This is very peculiar indeed, because Darwin was declared dead several years ago in December 2003 after he went kayaking on the North Sea in March 2002 and never returned. Rescuers who had gone out to sea to look for him found nothing but his canoe smashed to pieces, leading them to believe that Darwin had probably drowned after a canoeing accident. Yet, here he stood. The last clear thing I remember before any of this is a holiday in Norway in the year 2000, he says. I have hazy recollections of being in a kayak, but I cannot remember the accident or anything leading up to it at all. When asked what 9/11 was about, Darwin said 20, and when asked about 7/7, referring to the 2005 London bombings, Darwin said 14. It did seem like Darwin really had amnesia, until his medical records came back, and it was discovered that Darwin's symptoms were not at all similar to symptoms experienced by people living with amnesia. Darwin had been faking the entire thing. He and his wife had been neck-deep in debt. So, they hatched an elaborate plan to fake his death for the insurance money. The duo even lied to their sons, making them believe that Darwin was dead, while cashing out and living la vida loca in Panama. Unfortunately for them, Panama's visa laws changed, and they had to verify their identities and upgrade to an investor visa if they wanted to remain in the country. Darwin knew his faked identity wouldn't pass this level of scrutiny, so he decided to return to the UK using his real name and a fake amnesia. So, yes, it is entirely possible that Kyle was faking the whole amnesia thing. But do we have proof though? Well, there are some sketchy aspects about Kyle's story that I haven't mentioned yet, and perhaps no other person is better equipped to answer the question about whether Kyle was faking his amnesia or not than Catherine Slater, the woman who took him in and housed him for several years. Now, I should probably begin by telling you that Kyle wasn't entirely the person he portrayed himself to be. Sure, you look at him in the photos and the videos, and he looks like a lost little puppy just trying to find out who he is in this world. But there was definitely a lot more to Kyle. To begin with, Kyle's departure from the shelter is actually shrouded in a bit of controversy. Michael Elliott, the shelter's president, claims that Kyle left very dramatically. Apparently there had been some dispute over pay, and Kyle just up and hung his ring of keys one day and then left the shelter never to return. Fortunately for Kyle, he and Slater were already friends at the time, so she invited him to come live with her since he had nowhere else to go. The arrangement, however, turned out to be less than ideal for Slater because the more she got to know Kyle, the less she believed his stories. For one, Kyle didn't appear very eager to recover his true identity. Slater was the one doing all the work of contacting media outlets, online sleuths, detectives, the works. Kyle, on the other hand, hardly lifted a finger to help. When she asked him why, Kyle claimed that he had been Benjaman Kyle for a long while already, and so even if she figured out who he really was, he was probably always going to feel like Benjaman Kyle. At first, this explanation made sense to Slater, but as time went on, Slater started to sense that something was off with Kyle. She started to sense that he liked being the amnesiac with no past and no family. The only question was why? Perhaps there was a trauma in his past because his motives didn't seem financial. On multiple occasions, Slater had tried to raise funds to get Kyle a new apartment, but Kyle wouldn't accept any of the donations. He seemed really averse to charity of any kind. If only he could be a better house guest, though. Perhaps letting Kyle into her home would continue to remain one of Slater's biggest regrets in life. The man proved himself to be a horrible roommate, hoarding useless stuff, tearing down parts of her house, and starting a fire in her backyard without a burn permit. All of these things finally pushed Slater to the edge, and she asked him to leave. Now, I want you to take note of something in Kyle and Slater's relationship, because it plays itself out again. When Slater first met Kyle, he had appeared very charming, making her wonder why anybody wasn't looking for him. But then as she got to know him better, she started to see his true colors in some sense. It's almost like Kyle had created this persona of a lost, wounded puppy just waiting to be taken in, given a name, and cared for. Like he engineered his entire Benjaman Kyle personality just to draw sympathy from people.
Hello, my name is Benjaman Kyle. You don't know who I am, and quite frankly, neither do I. For the past 6 years, I've been looking for something. Something just out of reach.
What's the matter? What?
I'm sorry, but who are you?
Hector has been hurt in a horrible accident. He can't remember who he is. He got amnesia.
I don't have a social security number, but I'm still a person. Nobody has recognized me, but I still have a past. I'm going to tell you my story because I want a future. I can't do this by myself. This is my SOS. My name is Benjaman Kyle, and this is my story.
And it just makes you wonder all the more what dark past Kyle could possibly be hiding. Anyway, as I told you before, it wasn't just Slater who fell for Kyle's seemingly fake persona. After Kyle left Slater's, he went over to Jacksonville, where he got a job washing dishes at Crazyfish, a small restaurant on the water. The owner, Josh Schrut, would end up discovering that Kyle knew a lot about restaurant equipment, from how to work the grill, to how to calibrate the deep fryer, to storing pans and cleaning equipment. As usual, Kyle showed himself to be a hard worker, so it wasn't long before he became Schrut's best employee. Just like Slater, Schrut found that, for some reason, he was just drawn to Kyle. In fact, according to Schrut, he's normally a very suspicious and paranoid person who sleeps with a gun next to his bed. But for reasons he just couldn't explain, he found himself completely trusting Kyle. That is, until he didn't. It appears that at some point, Kyle moved in with his boss, and as you might have already predicted, this arrangement led to interesting revelations for Schrut. Primarily, Schrut observed that Kyle tended to have a photographic memory on everything else except his own story. Ask him anything about anything under the sun and Kyle would give you his opinion. But then, right after, ask him something about himself and he'd immediately get suspiciously vague. Peculiar, isn't it? It just seems like everyone who ever gets to be in a close relationship with Kyle ends up doubting his stories or being suspicious of him at the very least. But shouldn't it be the other way around? If Kyle was really an amnesiac, then shouldn't those who lived with him be able to confirm that without a shadow of doubt? Why is it different with Kyle? Why do people who get close to him end up doubting him? Slater doubted him. Schrut doubted him. Colleen Fitzpatrick, the genealogist who had tried to help him find his family, had her doubts after he abruptly cut her off just as she was getting closer to a solution. Which, by the way, lends credence to what Slater mentioned about his seeming disinterest in being found. Sure, Moore eventually discovered his true identity, but remember that this wasn't exactly with Kyle's help, at least not for the most part. Plus, when she called to tell him the news, he actually hung up on her. And that's not all. There's this website called Websleuths.com. It's essentially a hobbyist message board where internet sleuths come together to work on missing persons cases, oftentimes spending hundreds of hours on a case and even beating the police to a solve on a number of occasions. So suffice to say that these guys know what they're doing. Anyway, in 2007, Kyle's case was one of the most popular cases on the site, until slowly, many members of the site started to come to the same conclusion that Kyle wasn't telling the truth, at least not the full truth. The web sleuths had two major pieces of evidence underpinning their conclusions. The first was that, contrary to the story going around, Kyle was not found unconscious. A member of the form had spoken to one of the officers who responded on the day that Kyle was found, and the officer claimed that Kyle was fully conscious when he was found. The officer also claimed that Kyle was able to talk, he just chose not to. Secondly, both Kyle and Slater had been reluctant to share Kyle's medical records. Their reason at the time was that Memorial, the hospital Kyle was transferred to, asked for money that they didn't have. However, a web sleuth who claimed to have contacted Memorial alleged that the hospital said that they gave Kyle his full medical records in August 2008, free of charge. All of these odd stories taken together in context definitely do not paint Benjaman Kyle in the best light. But what if he was actually genuine? Let's begin with this man, Harold Copus, a highly respected investigator and FBI case manager. When Kyle and Slater were invited by Dr. Phil, Copus was also invited to sniff Kyle out and make sure that he was genuine before going on the show. Copus's conclusion? He believed Kyle, by 90%. Yes, it's not 100%, but coming from a man as highly respected as Harold Copus, and considering the doubt trailing Kyle, this is huge. According to Copus, every major aspect of Kyle's story checks out. The EMTs, Burger King employees, and all the responding officers on the day Kyle was found all said that Kyle was unconscious when he was found. He even looked dead, according to some. Copus also took Kyle to a psychologist in Atlanta, Dr. Jason A. King, and even though he never reveals King's conclusions, he does say that Kyle's medical report gave him confidence that Kyle was telling the truth, and it's kinda hard to argue with science. As for the officer that told the web sleuth that Kyle was found conscious, when an investigative reporter reached out to him, he denied this claim and confirmed the initial story, that is, that Kyle was found unconscious and unable to speak. to be honest, most of the medical reports from the examinations carried out on Kyle seemed to support the claim that Kyle wasn't faking his amnesia. He really couldn't remember who he was. Twice at the hospital in Richmond, Kyle suffered a psychotic episode for which he was treated with antipsychotic medication from October 2004 to January 2005. You can't exactly just up and fake a psychosis, can you? And even if you do, a professional psychologist should be able to smell your ruse from a mile away. And that's not all. Dr. Jason King took Kyle through 21 different neuropsychological tests, and they all led him to the conclusion that Kyle wasn't faking it. And it's a little hard to argue with that, because, I mean, if a doctor puts someone through 21 different tests and still ends up not being able to tell that his patient is faking his illness, then his license should be revoked. Anyway, from King's examination of Kyle, he believes that Kyle has something called dissociative amnesia. And according to the Merck Manual of Diagnosis and Therapy, this is when a person starts to forget important personal information that should not typically be lost with ordinary forgetting. Now, there are different types of dissociative amnesia, and Kyle's case looks a lot like fugue. In fugue, the sufferer forgets who they are, travels to a new location, and sometimes even creates an entirely new identity. The Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders says that fugues are a catastrophic form of dissociative amnesia, and Kyle isn't the only one who has suffered at its hand. In 1887, a man named Ansel Bourne set out for his sister's house via a horse-drawn streetcar. Tragically, he never arrived. Fast forward to 2 months later, and a man named A.J. Brown is asleep in his room when he suddenly wakes up in a panic. As the story goes, Brown had moved into Pennsylvania about 6 weeks earlier. Deciding to settle in Norristown, Brown rents a small apartment as well as a shop where he sells toys and candy. Every week, Brown would go to Philadelphia to get more stock for his shop, and then on Sundays, he'd attend the Methodist church just down the road. For 6 whole weeks, this had been A.J. Brown's life. And yet, on that fateful day, when he woke up, nothing at all felt familiar. Not one thing. Anxious, Brown rushes down to his landlord, demanding that he tell him where he was and how he got there. The landlord gets even more puzzled when Brown explains to him that his name isn't A.J. Brown, but Ansel Bourne. Brown then gives the landlord information about his nephew, whom the landlord sends for via telegraph. When Brown's nephew arrives, he confirms Brown's story. Brown is actually Bourne. Later, when Bourne would try to recall how he got to Norristown from his home in Rhode Island, he would realize that he had no memories of those 6 weeks. The only thing he remembers is the streetcar that was supposed to take him to his sister's house. As you can see, this sounds a lot like Kyle's experience, which further supports the conclusion that Kyle experienced dissociative amnesia. I should point out, though, that most known cases of fugue have only been known to last days or months at the highest, which makes Kyle's case even more odd, as he seems to have been in the fugue state for 2 decades. For the time being, though, let's say that was the case. After all, we have the bulk of medical reports leaning towards this conclusion as well. The question, however, will now be, what could have happened to Kyle to trigger this state? Because from what we know, dissociative amnesia is usually caused by stress or trauma. In fact, it's not uncommon for a person who has suffered a lot of trauma to experience amnesia. And that's because in a person with trauma, amnesia could be a way to cut off the flow of traumatic thoughts and protect the brain from more suffering. Fugue seems to be a much exaggerated form of this impulse, and though not very common, it's been observed in people with very abusive childhoods. And as it turns out, Kyle did have a very traumatic upbringing. According to Kyle's older brother, Furman Jr., the Powell household had been very chaotic. Their mom, Marjorie, was a hoarder, which probably explains Kyle's instinct to hoard. Their father, Furman Sr., was an alcoholic and an abuser who seemed to single out Kyle as the object of his wrath. Furman Jr. wouldn't go into the details, but he did say that the abuse was regular and brutal. Perhaps it was this trauma that Kyle's brain was trying to protect him from when it went into fugue. I mean, it's not far-fetched. Look at Kyle's adopted name, for instance, Benjaman. The name has Hebraic roots and means beloved son. This sounds like an irrelevant detail until you realize that in dissociative amnesia, even though the consciousness might not be able to access the traumatic memory, a person's behavior could still be subconsciously influenced by said memory. So it's entirely possible that Kyle's trauma influenced his choice of an adopted name, even though he couldn't remember it. In the same way he hoarded even though he couldn't remember who his mother was or the fact that she was a hoarder. The only question that remains now is, what exactly was Benjaman Kyle up to for the 20 years he was missing? Did he take a different name and live a different life like Ansel Bourne? Is that where the name Benjaman came from? Well, Kyle, or should I say Powell, believes so. It's the answer that makes the most sense, he thinks. Unfortunately, memories made during a fugue are never recovered, so we'll never know what Benjaman Kyle or William Burgess Powell was up to all the 20 years that he was missing. By the way, I mentioned something about alien abductees in the video, and maybe you overlooked that because you think aliens aren't real. Well, in 1994, more than 60 kids in a small town in Zimbabwe had an alien encounter that changed their lives forever. Watch this next video to see for yourself.